Some of the deepest pain we experience in life does not come from betrayal, rejection, or loss alone. Often, it comes from the moment reality collides with the image we created in our minds. Someone we trusted without question reveals a side of themselves we never expected to see. A person we admired fails to live up to the character we believed they possessed. In those moments, the hurt can feel far greater than the event itself. The reason is simple. Reality did not suddenly become harsher. The story we believed about reality was stronger than the truth. Few experiences are more unsettling than realizing that much of human suffering begins not with what people actually do, but with what we quietly assume about them. Long before modern psychology explored these ideas, the Stoics understood this principle well. They taught that suffering often comes not from events themselves, but from the judgments and meanings we attach to them. Human beings are complicated. Every person carries the potential for wisdom and foolishness, generosity and selfishness, strength and weakness, loyalty and inconsistency. Yet the mind dislikes complexity. It longs for certainty and simple answers. So it transforms ordinary people into symbols, ideals, and expectations. When those expectations eventually break, reality can feel cruel. But reality did not change. The illusion did. Hidden inside that disappointment is something many people miss, an opportunity to see more clearly than before. The day our illusions begin to fall apart is often the day understanding begins to grow. Not only understanding of other people, but understanding of ourselves, the assumptions we make, the stories we create, and the expectations we carry without even noticing. Clarity is rarely comfortable in the beginning, yet it remains the foundation of true freedom. Once that clarity arrives, it becomes difficult to view people, relationships, and life in the same way again. Most disappointments begin long before the event that appears to cause them. They start quietly, almost invisibly, inside the private world of expectation. Someone enters our lives and, without realizing it, we begin adding qualities that were never truly there. We notice a few admirable traits and assume the rest of their character matches those qualities. We witness a moment of kindness and imagine a permanently kind person. We hear words that sound sincere and assume they are supported by the same level of wisdom, loyalty, or emotional maturity. None of this is usually intentional. It happens so naturally that we hardly notice it happening at all. The mind struggles with uncertainty. It prefers a complete picture, even when the information available is incomplete. So it fills in the missing pieces. It creates a version of reality that feels consistent, safe, and comforting. Then one day, reality presents a detail that does not fit the image we built. Suddenly, the picture begins to crack. This is why disappointment often feels so deeply personal. On the surface, it seems as though another person has let us down. They behaved differently than we expected. They made choices we never imagined they would make. They revealed parts of themselves that did not match the version we carried in our minds. But beneath that reaction lies something even deeper. The pain is not only about what they did, it is also about the story that can no longer survive. The future we imagined begins to fade. The belief we carefully protected starts to lose its foundation. What hurts is not only the reality we are facing, but the reality we thought we had. The Stoics recognize that much of emotional suffering comes from confusing what belongs to us with what never did. Another person's character, decisions, emotions, and personal growth belong entirely to them. We may influence these things, but we cannot control them. Yet many people build their peace on the expectation that others will behave according to their hopes, values, or desires. When reality refuses to follow that script, disappointment feels unfair. But reality was never required to follow our expectations. It was only required to be what it is. This becomes especially clear in relationships. People often grow attached not only to who someone is, but to who they believe that person could become. Potential can be incredibly powerful. It invites the imagination to step in and complete the picture. Someone may show moments of discipline, kindness, ambition, or emotional growth, and those moments slowly become the foundation for a much larger vision of who we believe they are becoming. Before long, the future version of that person begins to carry more emotional weight than the person standing in front of us today. Our attention shifts away from what they consistently show us and toward what we hope they will eventually become. There is comfort in this process because it gives hope a central role. Hope itself is not the problem. The problem begins when hope quietly turns into expectation. What started as a possibility slowly becomes something we believe should happen. Then, time passes. Instead of becoming the person we imagined, they remain exactly where they are. The disappointment that follows can feel overwhelming because the loss exists in two places at once. We lose not only what was real, but also what existed in our imagination. Many people spend years holding on to versions of others that exist only in their minds. They interpret actions generously when those actions support the image they have created, and overlook evidence when it challenges that image. Small warning signs are explained away. Contradictions are minimized. Patterns of behavior are treated as temporary exceptions rather than important information. This is not always because someone is naive or unaware. Often, it is because accepting reality would require letting go of a story that feels comforting and familiar. As the Stoics understood, people are often disturbed less by events themselves and more by the meaning they assign to those events. Human beings naturally resist loss, and few losses feel as quiet or as subtle as the loss of an expectation. There is no obvious event to grieve. Nothing physical disappears. Yet internally, something important has ended. A possibility that once felt almost certain no longer exists. The mind must rebuild itself around a new understanding, and that adjustment can be more painful than many people expect. There is another reason expectations become so difficult to release. Expectations create a feeling of emotional security. Predictability feels safe. Believing that someone will always act in a certain way creates the illusion of stability. The mind relaxes when it believes it knows what comes next. But life rarely offers that kind of certainty. People change. Circumstances change. Emotions rise and fall. Priorities shift. Even good people with good intentions can behave inconsistently. Expecting perfection from human beings is, in many ways, expecting them to stop being human. The Stoic perspective was never about becoming cynical, suspicious, or emotionally distant. It was about understanding reality clearly enough that disappointment loses its power to control the mind. Acceptance does not mean lowering standards. It means refusing to build emotional peace on assumptions that no one can guarantee. Over time, something begins to change. Instead of asking whether people will become who we hope they become, we start paying attention to who they repeatedly show themselves to be. Instead of investing all our emotions in imagined futures, we learn to observe present realities. This does not make relationships colder. If anything, it makes them more honest. Appreciation becomes rooted in what actually exists rather than what may someday exist. Respect becomes based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. Trust becomes something earned through consistent actions instead of something granted because of imagined potential. And perhaps this is where real peace begins. Not when reality finally bends itself to match our expectations, but when our expectations learn to align themselves with reality. Wisdom rarely arrives in a single moment of realization. More often, it grows slowly through reflection, experience, and a willingness to see things more clearly over time. Perhaps one reason expectations become so powerful is because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. The human mind naturally seeks order. It wants clear answers, predictable outcomes, and a sense of stability. When life feels complicated, the mind often tries to simplify it. People become labels. Situations become categories. Someone is either trustworthy or untrustworthy, strong or weak, honest or dishonest. These simple distinctions bring a sense of relief because they make reality feel easier to understand and therefore easier to control. But life rarely works that way. The longer we observe people honestly, the harder it becomes to place anyone into a single category. Most people are a mixture of strengths and weaknesses, virtues and flaws, confidence and insecurity. The challenge is not that human beings are impossible to understand. The challenge is that they are often far more complex than we want them to be. That complexity can be frustrating because it forces us to live without complete certainty. A person may be generous during one chapter of life and self-centered during another. Someone may display remarkable courage in one situation and retreat into fear in the next. Even the qualities people are most proud of can weaken when pressure grows. This does not necessarily make them dishonest or fake. It makes them human. The Stoics understood that character is not a permanent monument untouched by circumstances. Character is something that must be practiced, protected, and strengthened continuously. A person may value wisdom and still make foolish decisions. They may believe in honesty and still feel tempted to protect themselves through avoidance or excuses. The presence of one quality does not erase the possibility of its opposite. Yet many disappointments happen because we unconsciously assume otherwise. Part of this difficulty comes from admiration. Admiration has a way of narrowing our vision. When we deeply respect someone, we often focus on the qualities we admire while overlooking everything else. A kind person slowly becomes kindness itself. A disciplined person becomes the very symbol of discipline. A confident person becomes someone we imagine never experiences doubt. Gradually, the image grows larger than the reality. What begins as appreciation slowly turns into idealization. The mind selects a few qualities and builds an entire identity around them, while everything else fades quietly into the background. In many ways, idealization can become another way of avoiding reality. Then, when a side of that person eventually appears that does not fit the image we created, the disappointment feels overwhelming. The reaction seems sudden. But often, the information was there all along. It simply existed outside the version of reality we had chosen to accept. This happens in friendships. It happens in relationships. It happens in workplaces. It even happens with public figures and people we admire from a distance. We often assume that because someone possesses one admirable quality, they must possess many others as well. Someone who communicates well is assumed to be emotionally mature. Someone who appears calm is assumed to have complete control over their emotions. Someone who displays confidence is assumed to be free from insecurity or self-doubt. But these assumptions often reveal more about the observer than the person being observed. The mind dislikes empty spaces. When information is missing, it fills those spaces with conclusions because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Instead of accepting that there are parts of another person we simply do not know, we create answers of our own. For a while, those answers feel comforting. Eventually, reality begins providing its own answers. When that happens, many people feel betrayed by the contradiction they discover. The patient person becomes impatient. The supportive friend becomes distant. The dependable colleague becomes inconsistent. Suddenly, the image begins to break apart. But the contradiction was not newly created. It had always been there. Human beings have always carried opposing forces within themselves. Strength exists beside weakness. Confidence exists beside fear. Generosity exists beside self-interest. The Stoics never viewed this as a flaw unique to certain people. They saw it as part of being human. Every person lives with competing tendencies and conflicting impulses. Some people manage them better than others, but no one escapes them completely. Understanding this can change the way we experience disappointment. Instead of believing someone suddenly became a different person, we begin to recognize that different sides of their character existed at the same time. One side simply remained hidden until circumstances brought it into view. Pressure often reveals what comfort can hide. Stress exposes weaknesses. Success reveals character. Loss reveals priorities. Time reveals patterns. Under pressure, people often do not become someone new. They reveal parts of themselves that were already there beneath the surface. These experiences rarely create entirely new qualities. More often, they uncover qualities that already existed but had not yet been seen. This perspective does not excuse harmful behavior. It does not mean lowering standards or accepting mistreatment. It simply encourages a more realistic understanding of human nature. And perhaps that understanding is one of the first steps toward wisdom itself. There is a unique kind of freedom that comes from accepting this reality. Expectations become less rigid. Perception becomes more balanced. Instead of searching for perfect people, we begin learning to understand people as they truly are. This allows us to appreciate others without creating illusions around them. Someone can be admired without being idealized. They can be respected without being placed on a pedestal. Their strengths can be recognized without pretending their weaknesses do not exist. In many ways, this creates healthier and more honest relationships because it removes the impossible burden of perfection. No one is expected to maintain an image that no human being could realistically sustain. Perhaps this leads to an even more important realization. The real question is not why people sometimes disappoint us. Human beings have always been imperfect. The deeper question is why we expected them to be free from contradictions in the first place. Once that expectation begins to fade, a different kind of understanding starts to emerge. An understanding built not on fantasy or judgment, but on observation. From that point forward, relationships become less about managing expectations and more about seeing clearly. As people begin paying attention to patterns instead of isolated moments, the way they view others slowly changes. At first, the shift is almost invisible. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no single moment of revelation that suddenly changes every relationship overnight. Instead, there is a gradual movement away from impressions and toward observation. Words still matter, but they no longer carry the same weight they once did. Promises become less convincing than behavior. Intentions become less important than actions. What people repeatedly do begins to matter more than what they occasionally say. This shift can feel uncomfortable because it removes many of the shortcuts the mind prefers to rely on. It is easier to believe a convincing explanation than to patiently observe a pattern. It is easier to trust a promise than to wait for evidence. Yet time has a remarkable way of revealing truths that appearances can only hide temporarily. The Stoics placed great importance on consistent behavior because they understood something important. Character is not measured by isolated moments. Anyone can act well when circumstances are favorable. Anyone can be patient when nothing is testing their patience. Anyone can appear generous when generosity costs them very little. Character reveals itself when life becomes difficult. It becomes visible through repetition. A person who repeatedly chooses honesty when dishonesty would be easier reveals something meaningful about who they are. A person who consistently accepts responsibility instead of shifting blame demonstrates a quality that cannot be imitated forever. These patterns often develop quietly and slowly. Because of that, they may not attract immediate attention. Yet over time, they usually tell a more accurate story than dramatic gestures or impressive words ever could. Understanding this changes the way disappointment is experienced. Instead of focusing entirely on one event, attention naturally begins to move toward the larger pattern. A single mistake no longer defines a person, neither does one admirable act. The focus shifts toward consistency. Someone who occasionally forgets a commitment is very different from someone who repeatedly breaks promises. Someone who loses their temper once during an extremely stressful moment is different from someone who regularly uses anger to control others. The difference matters because human beings are imperfect. Everyone has moments they wish they could take back. Everyone falls short from time to time. The real challenge is learning to distinguish between occasional failures and recurring patterns. That distinction often determines whether our understanding is rooted in reality or driven by emotion. As observation becomes deeper, certain truths become difficult to ignore. The friend who only reaches out when they need something begins to stand out. The person who constantly speaks about loyalty while repeatedly choosing convenience over commitment becomes easier to understand. The individual who claims to value honesty but reacts defensively whenever confronted with uncomfortable truths slowly reveals a contradiction through repeated behavior. None of these realizations come from a single conversation. They emerge gradually through accumulated evidence. One moment can be dismissed. Several similar moments begin forming a pattern. Eventually, that pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Over time, the mind begins to recognize that repeated behavior often reveals a person's priorities more clearly than words ever can. But this clarity brings an unexpected challenge. The more honestly we learn to see other people, the more difficult it becomes to avoid seeing ourselves with that same honesty. Observation is not a skill that stays focused on other people forever. Eventually, it turns inward. The same principles we use to understand others begin to apply to ourselves. Suddenly, it becomes harder to judge people only for their contradictions because we start noticing similar contradictions within our own lives. The desire to be recognized, the tendency to avoid discomfort, the habit of excusing certain behaviors in ourselves while criticizing those same behaviors in others. These patterns often remain hidden until we begin paying closer attention. That process can feel uncomfortable because most people prefer to see themselves through the lens of their best moments. We remember the times we acted with courage, generosity, or wisdom. But genuine self-understanding requires something more. It asks us to look not only at our best moments, but also at our repeated habits and tendencies. What happens when we are under pressure? Who do we become when no one is watching? What choices do we continue making, even when we know they are not serving us? As Socrates once observed, an unexamined life is not worth living. These questions are not meant to create shame or guilt. They are meant to create awareness. And awareness is difficult to develop when our attention remains fixed only on the examples that support the story we want to believe about ourselves. Over time, a deeper understanding begins to emerge. People are not defined by what they say they value. They are gradually revealed by what they consistently practice. This is true in friendships. It is true in relationships. It is true in leadership. And it is true in personal growth. Patterns matter because they reveal what appearances often hide. They show where discipline is genuine and where it is only performance. They reveal whether values are truly principles or simply preferences that exist when circumstances are convenient. Most importantly, they encourage a more balanced understanding of both others and ourselves. As these patterns become clearer, illusions begin to lose their grip. What remains is not cynicism or distrust. It is a quieter and more grounded form of understanding, built on observation. From that place, both judgment and admiration become more measured, because they are no longer based on assumptions, but on something far more reliable: evidence collected over time. This is often where the process becomes uncomfortable. The same mind that creates simplified stories about other people often creates simplified stories about itself. Most people carry an image of who they believe they are. That image is carefully protected. It highlights strengths while softening weaknesses. It focuses on good intentions while overlooking repeated behaviors that tell a different story. It remembers moments of generosity while forgetting moments of selfishness. It recalls moments of courage while quietly pushing fear into the background. This is not necessarily dishonesty. Much of it happens automatically. The mind protects its preferred identity because certainty feels safer than contradiction. But reality rarely fits perfectly into the stories we tell ourselves. Just as other people are more complicated than they first appear, the same is true within each of us. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. Despite possessing enormous power and influence, he spent much of his private writing reminding himself to remain aware of his own weaknesses. He never assumed that wisdom made him immune to mistakes. He never believed that good intentions automatically produced good behavior. Instead, he understood that self-deception often disguises itself as self-confidence. The qualities we criticize in others often exist within us in different forms. Pride may look different from person to person. The same is true for insecurity, resentment, envy, or the desire for approval. Yet beneath those differences, the underlying human impulses are often remarkably similar. Recognizing this changes the way we see other people. Judgment begins to soften, not because standards disappear, but because understanding becomes deeper. The person constantly seeking validation becomes easier to understand once we recognize our own desire to be accepted. The person who reacts emotionally becomes less mysterious when we remember the moments when our own emotions overpowered our judgment. The colleague who struggles with criticism appears less flawed when we notice our own instinct to defend mistakes. The distance between observer and observed begins to shrink. Human behavior no longer looks like a division between wise people and flawed people. Instead, it begins to look like a collection of shared struggles expressed in different ways. From this understanding, a quiet form of humility begins to emerge. Not the kind that denies weakness, but the kind that acknowledges it honestly. Many people spend years trying to protect an image of themselves that feels admirable. They want to be seen as disciplined, wise, patient, emotionally balanced. These qualities matter. The problem begins when protecting the image becomes more important than facing the truth. That is often the moment growth starts to slow. Improvement becomes difficult because admitting flaws feels threatening. The ego shifts from seeking understanding to defending identity. Weaknesses become things to hide instead of things to examine. The Stoics approached this differently. They understood that self-respect and self-awareness are not opponents. In many ways, one depends upon the other. A person who cannot recognize their own weaknesses eventually becomes controlled by them. What remains unseen continues shaping behavior from the shadows. Impatience appears in conversations. Pride influences decisions. Fear quietly guides choices. These forces continue operating whether we notice them or not. Awareness changes that relationship. The moment a pattern becomes visible, it can be challenged. The moment a weakness is acknowledged, it loses some of its ability to control us unnoticed. And perhaps that is where genuine growth begins. Not in proving that we are already who we want to be, but in being honest enough to see who we are today. As this perspective begins to grow, even strengths start to look different. They are still valuable, but they are no longer placed on a pedestal. Discipline becomes something to practice rather than proof that someone is better than others. Wisdom becomes something to keep pursuing rather than something we believe we already possess. Confidence becomes quieter because it no longer depends on appearing flawless. Gradually, a person becomes more grounded, less reactive, and more willing to learn. The need to constantly defend or prove a particular identity begins to fade. This does not mean becoming harder on yourself. In many ways, the opposite happens. Greater self-awareness often leads to greater compassion because it reveals how difficult and complicated it is to be human. Everyone carries contradictions. Everyone struggles with thoughts, impulses, or habits they would rather not admit to. Everyone falls short of their own ideals from time to time. As Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself, before criticizing someone else, it is worth asking which of our own flaws most closely resembles the one we are about to condemn. Recognizing this reality creates patience. Not the kind of patience that excuses harmful behavior, but the kind that understands that growth is rarely immediate. Real change requires attention, it requires effort, and it requires repetition. Over time, a deeper form of acceptance begins to emerge. Not acceptance of every action or decision, but acceptance of reality as it exists right now. Strengths can be appreciated without exaggeration. Weaknesses can be acknowledged without shame. The need to divide ourselves into categories of success or failure slowly begins to disappear. What remains is something far more stable, a clearer and more honest relationship with reality. And strangely enough, that clarity often feels lighter than perfection ever did, because the exhausting burden of maintaining an illusion has finally been put down. Acceptance is one of the most misunderstood ideas in life. Many people hear the word and immediately associate it with giving up. They imagine lowering standards, tolerating poor treatment, or abandoning the desire for something better. But that is not what acceptance means. True acceptance is not passive. It is not weakness disguised as wisdom. Acceptance is simply the willingness to see reality exactly as it is before deciding how to respond to it. Nothing more, nothing less. The challenge is that many people spend more energy fighting reality than understanding it. They argue with facts that already exist. They become attached to how things should be while growing frustrated with how things actually are. This creates a constant internal struggle because reality does not change simply because we refuse to accept it. The Stoics understood that clear perception must come before wise action. A person cannot respond wisely to something they refuse to see honestly. Yet this happens every day. Someone ignores obvious signs that a relationship is unhealthy because accepting the truth feels too painful. Someone else continues expecting maturity from a person who repeatedly shows immaturity. Others spend years waiting for consistency to appear in someone who has always been inconsistent. The problem is not hope. Hope itself is valuable. The problem begins when hope replaces observation. When expectations become more important than evidence, disappointment becomes almost unavoidable. Reality continues speaking through behavior, while the mind remains attached to a different story. Eventually, a realization begins to emerge. It is simple, yet powerful. Other people are responsible for their choices, their values, their priorities, their growth, their willingness to learn and change. No amount of concern can replace another person's commitment to improving themselves. No amount of effort can permanently compensate for someone else's lack of responsibility. At first, this realization can feel disappointing because it removes the comforting illusion of control. But hidden inside that realization is an unexpected sense of relief. Once responsibility is returned to where it truly belongs, an enormous burden begins to lift. The pressure to manage another person's choices slowly starts to disappear. Attention naturally returns to something far more useful: our own conduct. Instead of becoming consumed by what another person should be doing, focus shifts toward what can actually be influenced. Our own decisions become clearer. Our standards become more meaningful. Our boundaries become easier to maintain. Emotional energy is no longer wasted trying to control situations that were never within our control to begin with. There is a quiet strength in understanding the difference between influence and control. One creates space for wisdom. The other often creates frustration. The more clearly this distinction is understood, the less chaotic life begins to feel. As this perspective continues to develop, other people's behavior begins to carry a different meaning. Their actions still matter, but they no longer determine emotional stability. In the same way, inconsistency becomes information rather than devastation. A broken promise becomes something to evaluate rather than something that destroys inner peace. An act of selfishness becomes evidence to consider rather than a personal attack to carry forever. This does not mean becoming cold or indifferent. It means becoming observant. Reality is allowed to reveal itself without immediate resistance. The mind stops demanding that every person behave according to personal expectations. Instead, it pays attention to what is actually happening. There is a quiet freedom hidden within this approach. Many emotional struggles become heavier, not because of the events themselves, but because of the meaning we attach to them. And the more clearly we see reality, the less power those unnecessary burdens begin to hold over us. When people behave in ways that hurt us, we often take it personally. If someone pulls away, we assume we did something wrong. If someone disappoints us, we feel responsible for their actions or for the outcome of the relationship. But the truth is that much of human behavior has very little to do with the people affected by it. More often, it reflects inner struggles, unresolved fears, personal habits, priorities, limitations, and experiences that existed long before we entered the picture. Recognizing this does not excuse harmful behavior. It simply places that behavior in a more accurate context. And from that understanding comes a calmer relationship with reality. Not because reality suddenly becomes easier, but because the struggle against it begins to fade. Acceptance allows facts to remain facts without turning them into emotional battles. Someone who repeatedly ignores boundaries is revealing important information. Someone who consistently acts with integrity is revealing important information as well. In both cases, reality is communicating something valuable. As Epictetus taught, Peace often begins when we stop demanding that life unfold according to our wishes and start learning from the way it actually unfolds. The challenge is learning to listen without allowing hope or wishful thinking to distort the message. Observation becomes more valuable than assumption. Clarity becomes more valuable than comfort. As this understanding deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself. When expectations become more realistic and responsibility is returned to where it belongs, relationships begin to feel different. The desire to change people starts to weaken. The need to idealize them slowly fades. Reality becomes easier to accept, both in others and within ourselves. And once that happens, an important question naturally appears. If no one is perfect, if every person carries both strengths and weaknesses, wisdom and blind spots, then what does genuine connection actually look like when it is no longer built on fantasy, control, or unrealistic expectations? That question leads to something far more meaningful than perfection ever could, because it shifts attention away from who people should be and toward who they truly are. Many people spend much of their lives searching for extraordinary people. They believe happiness depends on finding someone wise enough, loyal enough, emotionally mature enough, or exceptional enough to finally remove disappointment from their lives. The search feels reasonable. After all, everyone wants meaningful relationships. Everyone wants to feel understood. But hidden inside this search is an assumption that quietly creates suffering. The assumption is that relationships become stronger as imperfections disappear. The Stoics would likely challenge that idea. They understood that human beings are imperfect by nature, not because they are defective, but because they are human. People struggle with fear. They struggle with doubt. They carry contradictions, blind spots, and limitations. Expecting perfection from others is no more realistic than expecting perfection from ourselves. The more honestly this reality is accepted, the more clearly genuine connection begins to appear. For many people, relationships become exhausting because they are built around performance. There is constant pressure to maintain an image. Someone wants to appear strong, even when they feel uncertain. Someone wants to appear confident, even when they feel overwhelmed. Someone wants to appear successful, even while feeling lost. This is understandable. Human beings naturally want acceptance. They want approval. They want reassurance that they belong. But this creates an unexpected paradox. The more energy spent managing appearances, the harder it becomes to feel truly known. People may admire the image being presented, while the person behind that image remains hidden. The result is a quiet sense of distance that can exist even inside close relationships. That distance is rarely caused by a lack of conversation. Many people speak often while revealing very little. Time is shared. Experiences accumulate. Conversations continue. Yet beneath the surface, an invisible barrier remains. That barrier is often not deception. It is fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of rejection. Fear that if certain weaknesses become visible, acceptance will disappear. Because of this, many people become experts at showing only the parts of themselves they believe others will approve of. They edit their struggles. They soften their insecurities. They hide their doubts. Eventually, the performance becomes so familiar that it begins to feel natural. Yet the irony is that people often become more approachable when they stop trying so hard to impress others. There is something deeply reassuring about honesty. Not dramatic honesty meant to attract attention, but quiet honesty grounded in self-acceptance. A person who can admit uncertainty without embarrassment often appears more confident than someone constantly trying to appear certain. A person who can acknowledge mistakes without collapsing into shame often earns more respect than someone determined to appear flawless. Authenticity has a calming effect because it removes the tension created by constant performance. People sense it, even if they cannot fully explain why. This is where a deeper understanding of connection begins to emerge. Real relationships are not built on the absence of flaws. They are built on the ability to see flaws clearly without allowing those flaws to define the entire person. Every person carries strengths and weaknesses at the same time. Everyone experiences moments of wisdom and moments of poor judgment. The challenge is learning to hold both realities at once. Idealization makes this impossible because it only sees strengths. Cynicism makes it equally impossible because it only sees weaknesses. Real understanding requires balance. It requires seeing the whole person rather than selecting only the pieces that support the story we want to believe. The Stoics repeatedly encouraged people to engage with reality rather than fantasy. That principle applies to relationships just as much as it applies to life itself. Interestingly, when illusions disappear, disappointment does not always increase. In many cases, it decreases. Expectations become more realistic. Reactions become less extreme. Human imperfections stop feeling shocking because they are no longer being measured against impossible standards. This creates room for patience, not blind tolerance, not the acceptance of harmful behavior, but patience grounded in understanding. An understanding that growth is often slow, that people are works in progress, that mistakes do not automatically erase a person's value. As this perspective grows, compassion begins to change as well. It is no longer based on seeing people as innocent or flawless. Instead, it comes from recognizing our shared humanity. The fears that influence one person often exist in another. The desire for approval, the struggle with uncertainty, the experience of falling short of personal ideals. These experiences belong to nearly everyone. Recognizing this softens judgment without removing accountability. It allows people to maintain standards while still respecting the complexity of human nature. Perhaps this is what maturity truly looks like. Not becoming immune to disappointment, not expecting perfection from ourselves or others, not withdrawing from relationships simply to avoid pain. Maturity is learning to see people clearly while remaining compassionate. It is recognizing imperfections without becoming consumed by them. It is accepting reality without becoming cynical. Eventually, the need for idealized versions of people begins to fade because reality itself becomes enough. And when that happens, connection no longer depends on performance, approval, or illusion. It becomes something quieter, something stronger, something far more lasting. Not because human beings suddenly become extraordinary, but because they are finally allowed to be human. Eventually, something begins to change, not in other people, but in the way reality itself is experienced. The people around us remain just as complex as they have always been. They still carry contradictions. They still possess strengths and weaknesses, ambitions and insecurities, moments of wisdom and moments of poor judgment. Human nature does not suddenly become simpler. If anything, the longer we observe life honestly, the more complexity we begin to see. Yet somewhere within that complexity, a quiet sense of stability starts to emerge. The constant need for certainty begins to fade. The urge to place every person into simple categories, trustworthy or untrustworthy, admirable or disappointing, slowly loses its power. There is less pressure to reach final conclusions, less urgency to define people completely. Instead, there is a growing willingness to observe, understand, and accept that some parts of human behavior will always remain difficult to predict. At first, this shift feels subtle. Nothing dramatic changes overnight. But situations that once triggered strong emotional reactions begin to feel different. Someone's inconsistency becomes easier to notice without immediately taking it personally. A disappointing experience no longer becomes proof that people cannot be trusted. In the same way, a positive experience no longer creates unrealistic expectations about the future. Reality slowly finds its place between idealization and cynicism. As Aristotle once suggested, wisdom involves the ability to consider an idea without immediately accepting it as truth. In a similar way, maturity allows us to recognize both strengths and weaknesses in people without rushing toward blind admiration or unnecessary distrust. There is something surprisingly peaceful about that middle ground. It frees us from constantly preparing for disappointment, while also releasing us from the exhausting task of maintaining impossible expectations. Many people spend years moving between these two extremes. They place someone on a pedestal, only to feel deeply hurt when reality fails to match the image they created. Then, in response to that disappointment, they move to the opposite extreme. They become guarded, suspicious, emotionally distant. They convince themselves that expecting the worst is simply being realistic. But expecting the worst is no more accurate than expecting the best. Both replace observation with assumption. Both create certainty where certainty does not exist. The Stoics understood that wisdom asks for something different. It asks us to remain grounded in reality without becoming controlled by either optimism or pessimism. Perhaps this is why genuine maturity often appears quieter than people expect. It is not dramatic. It does not need attention. It reveals itself in small moments. In remaining calm when someone reveals a flaw. In adjusting expectations when new information appears. In refusing to turn every disappointment into a personal crisis. There is real strength in that kind of stability. Not because it removes pain, but because it prevents pain from becoming confusion. People will still make mistakes. Relationships will still face challenges. Trust will still be tested. But these experiences stop feeling like violations of how life should work. Instead, they begin to feel like natural parts of being human. As this understanding grows, compassion begins to take on a different form. It is no longer built on unrealistic expectations or idealized images of people. Instead, it becomes rooted in realism, a recognition that every person carries burdens that others cannot see. Everyone has blind spots. Everyone struggles with something. This perspective does not remove accountability, and it does not require accepting harmful behavior. Boundaries still matter. Standards still matter. The difference is that judgment becomes less reactive. There is less shock when imperfections appear, because imperfections are expected, not celebrated, not excused, simply acknowledged. One of the most important changes happens in the relationship with personal worth. Many people unknowingly tie their value to the reactions of others. They look for reassurance through approval, through attention, through admiration, through acceptance. When those things are present, they feel secure. When those things disappear, self-doubt quickly follows. But over time, another understanding begins to emerge. A person's worth was never meant to depend entirely on how others respond to them. Because approval can change, attention can fade, opinions can shift. But a life built on self-respect, character, and personal values stands on something far more stable than the changing emotions of other people. When our sense of worth depends entirely on the approval, attention, or acceptance of others, we build our inner peace on a fragile foundation. The problem is not that appreciation feels good. It does. The problem is that we place our emotional stability in the hands of circumstances we cannot control. The more clearly we understand reality, the less appealing that arrangement becomes. Slowly, self-worth begins to rely less on external validation. Not because approval stops mattering, but because it is no longer treated as proof of our value. This creates a very different relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like a threat that must be eliminated as quickly as possible. Instead, it becomes something we can live with. Some relationships will last, others will not. Some people will exceed our expectations, others will disappoint us. And often, the same person will do both. Life becomes easier to navigate when these possibilities are accepted rather than resisted. The need for guarantees slowly begins to fade, because guarantees were never truly available in the first place. What remains is a greater ability to meet reality as it unfolds. And perhaps this is where genuine peace begins. Not in finding perfect people, not in creating a life without disappointment, not in protecting ourselves from every possible risk or uncertainty. Peace begins with clarity, the ability to see people as they are without demanding that they become something else. The ability to recognize flaws without becoming cynical. The ability to appreciate strengths without turning them into fantasies. There is a quiet freedom in this perspective because it ends the constant struggle between reality and expectation. In the end, people remain imperfect. They continue carrying contradictions, uncertainties, and limitations. But once the need for certainty begins to disappear, those imperfections stop feeling threatening. They simply become part of what it means to be human. And in that acceptance, something remarkable happens. The world does not suddenly become better. It does not become worse. It simply becomes clearer. And more often than not, clarity is where wisdom begins. The day you stop romanticizing people is not the day you lose faith in humanity. It is the day you begin seeing people more clearly. Imperfect, complicated, capable of both strength and weakness, not so different from yourself. And strangely enough, that clarity does not make life colder. It makes it more peaceful. Because when you stop asking people to be perfect, you finally give yourself permission to appreciate what is real. If this reflection resonated with you, continue exploring the journey. One of the videos on your screen right now explores another powerful Stoic lesson that can deepen your understanding of yourself, your relationships, and the way you move through life. Stay with that thought. Keep learning. Keep growing. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Until next time, protect your peace, seek wisdom, and continue growing stronger from within.